Now that we have seeded our database with the user as well as their roles, it's time to bring everything together with our API. So first thing first, let me close everything that we have open, and inside the product API, I will open up the product API controller. Right now we do not have any authorization in any of the action method. So let me add that right here. The getAction method that you see will be available only to authorized user. So we will add an authorized attribute right here. Then if we scroll down, we also have delete. Let's say delete will only be accessible to authorized user whose role is equal to admin user. Now right here I was tempted to write SD and then use control dot to add reference to mango.web, but like I've said before, we do not reference different projects in microservices. So if you want, you can create a separate static details for product API, or I will just use magic string for now. So delete will only be accessible with the role of admin, and everything else stays the same, but with the authorized attribute. Let me copy this and paste that in other places. So everything else will need to be authorized, only then we will retrieve that. With that, let me select the startup projects. This time we will run all three projects and let's see what happens. The project that we care about is the main web project. So here now, if you click on product, no result will be retrieved because authorization is not available to your API. So what we need to do in order to make this work from our main application, we have to first ask a user to log in. That will redirect to identity server. Once a user logs in, then we will get a token. So then we have to use the token that identity server provides us, and we have to pass that token with our API calls. If you examine the Swagger UI, this does not display that a bearer token is required. So we can change the Swagger UI inside the API to make sure that it knows that a bearer token is required. That we have to do inside the startup class file of product API. Before I do that, let me run the application one more time. I want to get the URL of identity server. I believe it is this one. Let me make sure. Yep, we will copy this and stop the application. Inside the startup, we need to configure the authentication. So when we are adding the controllers, after that we will say services.add authentication. We want to add the authentication of bearer. Then on this we can configure the JWT bearer token. So we'll say add JWT bearer. We will write bearer here. Make sure you do not make any spelling mistakes here. And we can configure the options. Inside options, we have to say where this bearer token will be coming from. So we have to define the authority, and this will be the URL of our identity server, because that is the place that will issue the bearer tokens. And then we can say options.token validation parameters is equal to new token validation parameters. We will remove the using statement from here, add a control dot, add that, and for now I will set the validate audience to be false. So with this we have added the bearer token, but what we also need to do is we need to add authorization. We will add an authorization policy to make sure that the token is from the scope Mango, because if you examine the server here and inside the static details, we added the scope of Mango. So we will validate that as well. So right here we will say services.add authorization, and we have the options in authorization. I will say options.add policy. I will add a policy of API scope. For this particular policy, we will say policy.require authenticated user, and we can say policy.require claim scope comma, the name of the claim, that will be mango. Now this is a policy that we have added inside authorization. But when we are working here, we are not checking for any policy. But I wanted to show you that if you want to check with policy, this is how you can add a policy and you can check for the required claims. Even if you remove this line of code, application will still work, but I wanted to show how you can add policy and scope. So perfect, we have added authentication, authorization. Next thing we want to add is Swagger Gen documentation. We will modify this. Other than Swagger doc right here, we can add c.enable annotations, and we will be adding c.add security definition. This is just text that will be displayed. So we will add barrier here and then comma. We need to pass an object of Open API security scheme. So we will create a new Open API security scheme and we have to pass few properties right here like description. This is the description that will be displayed when someone enters the bearer token. So we will write here enter bearer and then a space is needed and your token. I will display you where this message will be displayed in just a while. Name, I will give that as authorization. Then we have two properties which is in, so parameter location dot header, that is where it will be displayed, and type will be security claim type dot API key. The scheme that we are using is bearer token. Now all of these properties are not required, but I'm just showing you how to configure things correctly. The last thing that is needed in here is we have to add security requirement. Last thing that we can add inside Swagger Gen is the security requirement. So c.add security requirement, not definition. This will be new OpenAPI security requirement. And again, we have to configure few properties. So right here, we will say new OpenAPI security scheme. And we will define the reference here as new OpenAPI reference, which will just have type and ID. So type will be reference type dot security scheme and ID will be bearer. Next, we have to define the scheme. This will be OAuth2 and name will be bearer again. Lastly will be the in, which is parameter location dot header. Perfect, so this looks good. And right here we will have to pass a new list of empty string. That's how we have to configure the OpenAPI security requirements. I know this is a lot of coding and something does not make sense here, but think of this as the format that is needed to enable security requirements inside the Swagger Gen. Alright, we have done a lot of coding. Let's run the application and see what's different. We don't want the main project, we want to see what is different in our API. You can see in header, now we have the authorized attribute. If you go back, you can see that inside Swagger Gen, we gave the name as authorization, in was inside the header, so it's right here. If you click here, you will notice bearer API key and enter bearer space. That is exactly what we have in here. So we configured the authorization. Whenever we have to enter a token here, we will write bearer and then we will enter the dummy token that we receive. So the token, we are not receiving that from the identity server yet, but we will do that in the upcoming videos. But our Swagger Gen documentation for product API looks good and we have added the authorization for our API.